Hello everybody, it's Sarah and I'm finally back to talk to you about cultures in fantasy. So I already made a video on this at the beginning of September, I think, part 1 to this what's now a series. I decided I'm going to make it a series. I'm gonna make multiple videos on this because there's multiple different topics I want to talk about that just won't fit into one video, and whenever there's a new topic coming up I will just make a new video on it. So I already did one video at the beginning of September, as I said, and that video was on incorporating different cultures into your fantasy novels and why I think I'm not alone in the opinion that it's bullshit that fantasy needs to be historically accurate and that fantasy needs to be white medieval times centric. Today's video, however, is going to be on a bit of a sensitive subject, I would say, because on the one hand I want to talk about depictions of cultures in general in fantasy and stereotyping in fantasy, stereotyping different cultures where I think maybe stereotyping is warranted and maybe even needed sometimes in fantasy. And then I also want to talk a bit or touch a bit on cultural appropriation and my thoughts on that cultural appropriation in fantasy. What happens when fantasy authors write about cultures that they do not come from. So yeah, let's get started, I guess. And the first thing I want to say, just as last time, in this video I won't really make a difference between culture and race, but that is mostly because I only want to talk about really culture in this video. I want to talk about the depiction of culture. I don't really want to talk about the depiction of race that much, or of how we look on the outside. I again want to concentrate more on culture, although a lot of times the way you look, of course, is also part of a culture. And also, for those of you who don't know why this topic interests me so much, is I study cultural and social anthropology. I am now in my master's and I would actually really like to write my master's thesis on this topic, but yeah, we'll see. That's a while off yet. And then also the second thing that I have to mention, of course, before we get started, is that there's a massive difference in the depiction of cultures and also the possibility to depict cultures in fantasy very in depth. That depends on the size of your series. If you have a series like here, for example, the Wheel of Time series that is 14 books long, that has a huge world, you of course have much more time and many more pages to spend time describing different cultures and also kind of exploring different cultures in that world. But then on the other hand, if you have standalones like the Priory of the Orange Tree, which still is a chunker and still has multiple cultures within its pages, you have a lot less time to really describe those cultures in depth. And so I do want to kind of go into the differences between huge series, huge epic series and standalones or even shorter series. I do want to go into the difference because I think in one case sometimes stereotyping and also coding, shorthand, it can't be avoided if you still want to have multiple cultures in your fantasy book. But first, before we get into the differences between bigger and smaller fantasy series and also stereotyping and when stereotyping in my opinion is warranted, I want to talk about something that I will just touch on a little bit, that I won't go into too much in depth on, because I do kind of a little bit want to make an extra video on that, but I want to do more research on that beforehand. And that is that a lot of times cultures in fantasy that aren't white kind of go through the same dynamics as non-white cultures in our world. And those dynamics are very much in connection with othering. So what othering is, for those of you who don't know, I didn't look up a definition right now, but just very shortly, for those of you who don't know, othering basically has to do with kind of an in-group, out-group mentality. And so everyone who is not seen as part of the own group, as part of the self, is part of another. And that leads to dynamics of othering that often lead to minorities in society being pushed like to the borders of society, to the periphery of a society because they are othered. And the same thing kind of a little bit happens in fantasy, because fantasy, I talked about it in the last video already, fantasy a lot of times is white and male. And fantasy is kind of seen through this white lens. And the self in fantasy, the culture that fantasy centers around, is a white culture. I want to talk a little bit about the example of A Song of Ice and Fire. I think all of the POV characters, actually I do not know if in the later books there's some minor POV characters that aren't Westerosi, but I think pretty much all, if not all of the characters in A Song of Ice and Fire are Westerosi. And Westeros, of course, is the representation in this world of medieval Europe, or more accurately, medieval Great Britain. And so you have these Westerosi main characters, and they do visit those other cultures. So you do get representation of different cultures. You have Bravos on Essos, you have the Dothraki, like you have Essos in general and all the cultures over there, so you have that whole other continent. However, the way those other cultures are described is always as other. And that is because you only see them through the lens of the white characters. You only see them through the lens of the European characters. You only see them through the lens of the Westerosi. And that is something that in general happens a lot in high fantasy. And I don't think that it's necessarily wrong to focus like your story in one part of the world, because that's what you have to do. You don't always have the space, again, in fantasy novels to have characters from all over the world. Sometimes you just have one or two main characters that come from the same part of the world, and you will see the other cultures through their eyes, and you will see the other cultures through the stereotypes they have of those cultures. And I do think that can be really interesting to explore in a novel, to explore kind of the stereotypes of characters going into other cultures and experiencing other cultures, and maybe then also exploring how their stereotypes differ from what these cultures actually are. So I don't think that it's necessarily wrong to always have other cultures kind of seen through a specific lens in your fantasy novels. However, it does become a problem when those other cultures are always the non-white cultures. But you can also kind of write the same dynamics into your books, but from a non-white viewpoint. For example, R.F. Kuang did that in the Poppy War, especially in the Dragon Republic, when we first get to see the Hesperians, I think their name was, which are like the white people. And I have talked in my review of the Dragon Republic that I did not exactly like the depiction of the Hesperians, not because I didn't like that like white people were written in a negative way, but just because I thought from a story standpoint they were written very stereotypical and they were written kind of boring. However, from a kind of deconstruction of colonialism and colonial imagery, I do think that what R.F. Kuang did was amazing, and I do love it from that viewpoint, just not from a storyline perspective. But if you want to read more about whiteness in fantasy, again, I do want to make a whole video on that, but that would go like way deeper. But if you want to know more right away already, I recently, because I wrote an essay on that, I wrote an essay on colonialism, racism, and race in fantasy. And for that paper, I did read a book, a non-fiction recently that I really enjoyed and that I can recommend. I forgot the exact title right now. I think it was Race in Popular Fantasy Literature, Habits of Whiteness by Helen Young, but I will leave the Goodreads link to that book down below in any case if you want to check it out. I found it really interesting because it kind of goes into the beginnings of fantasy and why whiteness has been written into fantasy since J.R.R. Tolkien, whom I have right here. On that note, also, I do want to make a video just like on fantasy races and how our race perception from our world is written into fantasy races. But again, that's gonna be a whole video that I still feel like I need to research a bit more, so it won't be in this video. So now that we have othering in fantasy out of the way, the question is, how do we write culture in fantasy? And I think it's one of those questions again where there's a lot of wrong answers, but not really any right answers or any definitive right answers. And the reason for that is because, in my opinion, you kind of, when you write about cultures in fantasy, you cannot write something completely new. That's just not possible. And I also don't think that it's necessarily something readers enjoy, because while fantasy is something new to us and we kind of like, it's kind of just put together from different places, there still is something familiar. We still need something familiar about the cultures, about the habits of the people within fantasy for us to really connect to them. And for that reason, I think that stereotyping in fantasy isn't always wrong and is sometimes even necessary. Because, for example, I have mentioned earlier already the Priory of the Orange Tree. And this is praised a lot for its amazing world building. And I gotta be honest, I don't think the world building in this novel is this unique. You basically have three different cultures that we spend time in. One is kind of Eastern Asian, one is kind of like Middle European, Western, and then one culture is Northern African. But the thing Samantha Shannon did, which I found absolutely amazing, is that she gave us just enough information that sometimes can be quite stereotypical, that we know what these cultures are based on. Like, I know one of the cultures is Eastern Asian without anything specific being in that culture. However, Samantha Shannon then puts enough unique spins on that basis, on that shorthand that she already put in there to let us know, okay, this is kind of the vibe we have. And then she put enough unique things into it to make her world building seem really intricate. And of course, because we spent most time in the European part of the world building, that's where most unique things are, but it's still very recognizable medieval Middle European. And also, actually, Samantha Shannon kind of goes around the problem of othering of other cultures, although she does put conflict between different cultures into her books, because she does have characters from all the different cultures in her book represented. So for all the cultures, you get representation from people coming from those cultures. And so you do not get that extreme feeling of othering of exotic cultures as you do in A Song of Ice and Fire. So I think Samantha Shannon really did a great job representing cultures, even cultures that aren't necessarily hers. And she really shows that sometimes shorthand and stereotyping can be really, really useful. However, where it doesn't get useful is something that I have noticed a lot in high fantasy, and that is the depiction of non-white cultures as the evil guys, which in most cases these cultures then are even like Middle Eastern. Like, I think I can just from the top of my head already say like 5 books or so that have Middle Eastern cultures or Middle Eastern style cultures as the evil guys, and a lot of times we do not really get to know those cultures because of course they're the evil guys, so of course we only see them as the enemy and we never really see anything from their perspective. A lot of times these cultures do not even have that much to do with like Middle Eastern countries, but most of the times they're kind of modeled after Orientalist stereotypes of 19th century European like stereotypes for Middle Eastern countries when it comes to like harems and so on. And that's another problem when it comes to depiction of cultures in fantasy. That's kind of Orientalism. Again, I also probably will make a video on Orientalism in fantasy because it's something that really interests me. If you're interested already in what Orientalism is, the go-to paper on this is just, I think it's just called Orientalism by, I don't know his first name, Said. I will also leave a link to the Goodreads to that paper down below. However, it is an academic paper and not like popular non-fiction, so be aware of that. But short explanation of what Orientalism is. Orientalism pretty much is a description of a culture that has more to do with your own views of that culture than what that culture actually is. And so it's more a reflection of your own society than that society that you're trying to describe. And a lot of times when it comes to Orientalism, of course, there's also some motivation, some hidden motivation behind that. But yeah, Orientalism generally in fantasy is also a big problem, because you kind of have these stereotypes that describe these cultures that maybe you don't spend any time in your fantasy novel, but that are kind of just described or that just kind of appear once and then vanish. J. Christoph, for example, has that a little bit with Polynesian societies, where he uses kind of stereotypes and kind of very Orientalist viewpoints of those societies and puts them into his novels, or into Nevernight in specific. So yeah, Orientalism is another thing aside from othering, where a lot of times it's of course not the white societies or the white adjacent societies that are the victims of these depictions in fantasy, but it's the non-white societies. And so the question is, again, how do we describe fantasy cultures? And I think there's nothing wrong with taking inspiration from real life cultures. I think that, again, if we have a huge fantasy world where we have different cultures, it's kind of necessary to not have all of them be white. And it's kind of necessary to kind of take inspiration from different cultures. And for example, I think, again, did I already say that I love the Aiel in the Wheel of Time series? I think they're an amazing culture, and I think I actually want to make a video just specifically analyzing them from an anthropological viewpoint. And Robert Jordan did take inspiration, even in specific rites of passage and so on, and specific habits from multiple different cultures that exist in our real world. However, he then managed to put them together in a non-stereotyping way to make this really unique culture, unique to his world culture, where you still see the influences that he got from our world, but they're not there in a way where it just feels like this culture is a stereotype. Of course, it also helps that we have some characters from this culture that appear as POV characters. And it also helps that a lot of our other white POV characters spend a lot of time in this culture and learn about that culture and kind of adapt to that culture, and then also adapt the way they act around the people. It's not that this other non-white culture has to adapt to the white way of life, as it is so often in fantasy books, where you do still have that kind of stereotype of the barbarian culture that then comes into the white society and is reformed. You do not have that. You instead have the white characters that go into this new society and that do adapt to that other society instead of the other way around. So I do think there's right ways to depict culture in fantasy, to depict non-white culture in fantasy, be it in a long series or even just in a standalone. And I also think that even as white authors, there's a way to do that that is not cultural appropriation. And of course, especially when it comes to fantasy novels, the line between cultural appreciation and cultural appropriation is very thin. And it's a slippery slope, I would say. And of course, me as a white reader, I won't say that either of these books are perfect. And I won't say that there's not issues with either of the books when it comes to the non-white cultures and their depiction, because there might very well be things that I have not noticed. However, when it comes to fantasy, again, I don't want to say the word lenient, but I think if we manage to kind of skirt along the line of being inspired by real life cultures while still respecting those real life cultures and not using the stereotypes those real life cultures have to face when we're describing our fantasy cultures, I think that it's possible to write different cultures. And again, also what I said in my first video, when it comes to a certain size in a fantasy book, you kind of have to get some non-white cultures in there, because you kind of have to get some, like, you know, it's not gonna be all white in the whole world. However, for example, I do think that when it comes to cultural appropriation in fantasy, I do think there's a difference if you have The Eye of the World or The Priory of the Orange Tree, which is a mostly white setting, but you kind of make excursions into cultures that are not white because the world is that big, compared to a world that is entirely influenced by a culture that is not your own. I think in a perfect world, no matter if you're white or not, no matter what ethnicity you belong to, again, if you kind of have those checkpoints of not stereotyping overly, not stereotyping harmfully, not othering, not using like Orientalist views in your books and so on, I think then technically it should not matter what ethnicity you are, you could write any story. However, and I did talk about that in my video on talking about own voices, which I will leave down below and up there. However, we do not live in the perfect world. We do live in a world where, sadly, white authors are given way more opportunities than BIPOC authors. And a lot of times, BIPOC authors are just given opportunities writing books that are own voices. Again, that's a whole other discussion whether fantasy ever really is own voices. For example, if you're an American Asian person and you write an Asian inspired fantasy, is it own voices, is it not? But like, that's a whole other discussion again. And so if you then have white authors writing fantasy that is inspired by cultures that they are not from, that is inspired by non-white cultures, they take away a big chunk of like opportunities from BIPOC authors that already don't have as many opportunities as they have. And as such, I do think that it is still an issue if you have white authors like Alison Goodman when she wrote Eon and Iona. And I did enjoy this book. But again, you then have white authors taking opportunities from BIPOC authors like R.F. Kuang, because a lot of times, additionally to having less opportunities, to then only getting opportunities writing own voices, a lot of times they are then told, like the BIPOC authors are then told, no, we don't want your story. We already have enough Asian-inspired fantasy. No one ever talks about too many Western-inspired fantasy, but again, racism is still rampant within the publishing industry, and so when it comes to cultural appropriation and fantasy and writing fantasy worlds, it's technically all open. You technically can be inspired by whatever in the real world, as long as, again, you're not playing into harmful stereotypes. But sadly, both the depiction and the choice of setting in your fantasy novels will like have repercussions in the real life world. And so it's not always just, it's fantasy, who cares? So yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to talk about today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, maybe think about giving me a thumbs up and also maybe subscribing. If there's any topics concerning cultures and fantasy that you want me to talk about in the future, tell me in the comments down below and I will check them out. Again, I have a few topics planned already, but I do want to kind of research a bit more before I jumped into those topics. These 2 videos so far were more or less just my thoughts without concrete research specifically towards these topics. And also tell me in the comments down below your thoughts on what I talked about stereotyping, about cultural appropriation, about coding, shorthand, Orientalism in fantasy, and so on. And with that said, all the links to my social media as well as all the links to my book club of Queens, Witches and Valkyries, where we read 1 adult high fantasy per month written by a woman, will be linked down below. In my book club this month we're reading The Vanished Queen by Elizabeth Campbell. I have not started it yet, I really need to. And with that said, I hope I'll see you soon. Bye!